Appendix 4, David Black. Black. The significance of the Pauline-weakness vocabulary, without exception, grows out of those concrete situations which he addressed in his letters. This is perhaps most clearly seen in the Corinthian letters, in which Paul finds himself forced to answer the criticisms of his opponents regarding his own weakness. If Paul had never been attacked so viciously by the opposition in Corinth, we might forever have gone without his long narrative concerning weakness in 2 Corinthians 10-13. This lengthy passage, so vital to a clear understanding of Paul's concept of weakness, is available to us today, humanly speaking, because of the failures of certain early Christians. Paul develops especially his Christological ideas of weakness in direct relationship with the church at Corinth, seeing this as the most effective way to handle the issues undermining his work among his converts. The emphasis upon Paul's personal weakness is also essentially restricted to the Corinthian audience, apparently because the subject was a matter of heated debate. The language of weakness thus conveyed a special meaning to Paul's Corinthian readers, a fact which explains why the terms are not employed with frequency in his other writings, both earlier and later. Any study of the Pauline weakness motif must therefore take into consideration Paul's concern to be relevant to the Christians to whom he writes. Nowhere in his letters does he attempt to systemize his teaching on weakness. The apostle himself seems oblivious to the pattern and principles which we will offer as Paul's theology of weakness. On the other hand, since the apostle certainly does have his own ideas about weakness, every attempt to discern the broad outlines of these ideas is appropriate. Again, in 2 Corinthians, where the attack against Paul is at its strongest, the largest complex of weakness language in the New Testament is to be found, 14 occurrences. Why is Paul so defensive, I would rather say assertive, of his own infirmities in 2 Corinthians? Only because a misunderstanding of his weakness leads to error concerning the nature and acquisition of divine strength. Paul is strong, but only because he is in Christ. Otherwise he freely admits to being Paulus infirmus. Black concluded, Paul's view of weakness is not to be understood only as an abstract doctrine, for it was developed in view of actual conditions. In the first place, weakness impresses upon us the reality of our finiteness and dependence upon God. Human attempts are completely useless to please God. With all of man's efforts, he can do nothing. It is just this attitude that Paul declares when he says he is weak. He can claim no credit for any of his successes, for he knows he has been sustained by God. If he has achieved anything, it is only by God's power working through a weak yet yielded vessel. Thus human initiative, human boasting, and human merit have no place in the thought of the Apostle Paul. Likewise, Paul teaches that God's way of exhibiting power is altogether different from man's way. Man tries to overcome his weakness. God is satisfied to use weakness for his own special purposes. Too many Christians become disheartened over their infirmities, thinking that only if they were stronger in themselves they could accomplish more for God. But this point of view, despite its popularity, is altogether a fallacy. God's means of working, rightly understood, is not by making us stronger, but by making us weaker and weaker until the divine power alone is clearly manifested. Finally, for Paul, weakness is the greatest sign of discipleship because it openly identifies the Christian with his crucified master. By his death, Christ proved that God's weakness was stronger than man's strength. This same Christ has now become the example which Christians are to follow. By bearing the cross of Christ and dying daily with him, they participate in the weakness of Christ. This identification with their Lord enables them to glory in their weaknesses, not merely endure them. Therefore, rather than wrestle with God for freedom from their weaknesses and limitations, the faithful see in these the power of another who promised, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is perfected in weakness," and of whom it was written, "He is not weak toward you, but is powerful in you. For indeed he was crucified because of weakness, yet he lives because of the power of God."